Red Willow, Wyoming Territory, the 3rd week of April in the year 1884. A woman stepped down out of a matrimonial agent's coach with 40 cents in her pocket and a canvas grip holding one dress besides the one she stood in. And in front of half that town she signed her name into the marriage register with a single crooked X. They laughed at her for it. A grown woman, they said, who could not write the 4 letters of her own given name, and she had gone and picked the one man in the valley the bank was already carrying to the auction block. They laughed at her for 8 weeks. Then she asked the banker to show her his books, and 3 days later the laughing stopped, and in that town it never quite started again. I have spent the better part of a year with what is left of that valley's paper, the recorder's deed books, the federal land office ledgers out of Cheyenne, the territorial secretary's commission rolls, and a court transcript so brittle at the fold that the clerk made me turn the pages with a ribbon. What I found in them is the reason I am telling you this instead of something easier. Stay with me to the end, because the part that will stay with you is not the arrest. It is what she asked for afterward, when the whole town was finally willing to give her anything she named. Isaiah Kellerman ran his brides the way another man might run a string of horses, and he did not pretend otherwise. He moved them by coach from Omaha, out along the rail towns and then north into the cattle country, 6 women at a time, and he took his fee from the groom, $10 a head, paid before the ink dried. He had a speech he gave from the boot of the coach. He gave it in Red Willow on a Thursday, in front of the Stockmen's Trust Bank, with the wind coming down off the bench and rattling the canvas awnings, and the whole street turned out to watch because in a town of 400 souls, a coach of unmarried women is better entertainment than a circus. There were 3 men bidding for wives that day, and 1 man who was not bidding at all. Zachariah Ingram had come in for barbed wire and a keg of nails, and he had made the mistake of stopping to hear what the shouting was. He was 35, and he carried a seam of scar from his left ear down under his collar, where a rope had caught him 3 winters back and taken him off a horse at a dead run. He stood at the edge of the crowd with his hat in his hands, because his mother had raised him to stand that way in front of women. Kellerman knew a mark when he saw one, and he called Ingram out by name, and that was when the town got its laugh, because everybody in Red Willow knew about the Bar C. Everybody knew Cormac Jessup had posted the notice on the bank's front glass in February, and that the Ingram place had a redemption date on it, and that the man had run 400 head through the worst winter anybody could remember, and still somehow owed the bank more in the spring than he had in the fall. The town did not read that as fraud. The town read it as a man who could not manage, a man with a scar and a dead wife and a bad head for figures. Kellerman asked which of his ladies would care to see the Bar C, and one by one they said no. They said it politely, and they said it plain. The first said she had not come west to be foreclosed on. The second laughed behind her glove. The third looked at the scar and did not say anything at all, which was the worst of the 3. And Zachariah Ingram put his hat back on and turned to go, because a man can only be told he is worthless so many ways in one afternoon before he starts believing the arithmetic. Myra Hawthorne stopped him. She was 29, and she had a walk that came off a horse rather than out of a parlour, and she had ridden at the back of Kellerman's line for 4 towns without being chosen and without seeming to mind it. She stepped down into the street and she asked Zachariah Ingram one question, and only one, and it was not about the mortgage. She asked him what he ran on the Bar C and how he watered it. He told her. Shorthorn crossed onto Texas stock, 400 and some head, 3 springs and a creek that came up out of the bench and did not fail even in the dry year of 81, and hay ground on the flat that would cut twice if a person was willing to work for it. He said it flat, like a man reading off an inventory of somebody else's property, because in his mind it already was. Myra Hawthorne said she would take him. The street went quiet the way a room goes quiet when a glass breaks somewhere behind you. Kellerman, who had never in his professional life been handed a difficulty like this one, tried twice to talk her into the freighter from Laramie who had a house with a stove in it, and she let him finish and then said no, thank you, she had made her choice, and would he kindly bring out the book? He brought out the book. Kellerman carried a Methodist circuit preacher along with him the way another man carries a notary, and the preacher had the county's own marriage register under his arm, and it went down open on the tailgate of the coach with the crowd pressed in close, and Myra Hawthorne took the pen, and she held it a moment, and then she set down one plain X. You could hear it travel. It went along the boardwalk and into the mercantile, and out the other side. She cannot write. The illiterate one picked the broke one. Somebody said, loud enough to be meant, that the two of them together could not sign a note for a sack of flour, and Lavinia Jessup, the banker's wife, standing under the awning with her gloved hands folded, said something quieter to the women beside her, and they all laughed, and that was worse than the shouting. Zachariah Ingram waited until the pen was down, and then he took Myra aside, by the wheel of the coach where the noise was thinner, and he told her the truth of it, all of it, because he was not a man who could stand to be chosen under a false measure. He told her the redemption date. He told her the bank held paper on every head of stock he owned. He told her that come the 12th of June there would likely be no Barcy at all, and that she should go on with Kellerman to the next town where there were men who could keep her, and that he would not think a single hard thought about her for it. She said, "I have been kept before. I did not care for it." And then she said the thing that half that town would remember years later, when they were telling the story on each other's porches and getting it slightly wrong. She said, "Mr. Ingram, I size up a man and a piece of ground better than most folks reckon. You just told me about your water before you told me about your trouble. A man who leads with his springs is a man who knows what he has got. I will take my chances on the springs." They were married that same afternoon by that same preacher in a church with 16 people in it, 11 of whom had come to look, and he wrote the date and his own hand in beside the mark she had already made in front of everybody. Kellerman took his $10, which Zachariah paid in coin out of the nail money, and drove his coach on north, and never appears in the record again. The Barcy sat 9 miles out on the north bench. Zachariah had raised the barn better than he had raised the house, which told her everything she needed to know about him before she ever got down off the wagon. Zachariah's wife Caroline had been dead 4 years of a fever that took her in 9 days, and the brand was hers, the Barcy, and he had never once considered changing it. Myra learned that in the first week, and she did not ask him to change it either, and something eased in him when she did not. They began as strangers keeping a careful house. He slept in the lean-to those first weeks, and neither of them made a remark about it. She rose before him anyway, and had the stove going, and he came in from the barn to find coffee, and neither of them said thank you, because on that bench thanks was a thing you did with your hands. She could ride. That was the first surprise, and it came on the third morning, when a 2-year-old heifer went down in the wire at the bottom of the hay flat, and Zachariah started for the house to get his rope, and found Myra already past him, at a long trot with hers, and by the time he got there she had the animal's head snubbed and was down in the mud with her knee on its neck, talking to it low and steady while she cut the barb out of the shoulder with her own knife. She packed the wound with pine tar. She did not ask him what to do, and she did not ask him to look at it after. That evening he watched her from the barn door and thought that Kellerman had sold him something and had not known what it was. She could keep a house too, but that was not the thing about her. The thing about her was that every night after supper she took down the account book, the one the bank made him keep and bring in quarterly, and she sat with it under the lamp for an hour, sometimes 2, turning pages slow and running one finger down the columns. Zachariah thought she liked the look of the numbers. Some folks did, the way some folks like the look of a river. He thought it was a comfort to her, the way a picture book is a comfort, and once gently, feeling like a fool the whole time, he offered to read a line of it out to her, and she said, "No, thank you, Zachariah. I do fine," and he let it go, because he did not want to shame her. She did not tell him. Not then. And I want to be fair to her about why, because it is the hinge of the whole business. Myra Hawthorne's father had hauled freight out of St. Joseph, and had kept a double-entry set of books on every wagon he owned, and Myra had kept them for him from the age of 11, because his eyes went, and hers did not. She could read a page of figures the way a hand reads weather. She could carry a column in her head. She had also learned, in the 6 years after he died, and the partners closed her out of the business with a paper she was not permitted to examine, that a woman who announces she can read a ledger is a woman who is never left alone with one. Underestimated is a kind of shelter. She had been living in it a long while, and it had kept her dry. What she found in Zachariah Ingram's account book in those first weeks did not add up, and the way it did not add up was not sloppy. It was tidy. That is what took her breath. He told her his side of it on a night in May with the rain coming sideways off the bench. He said he had gone in to Jessup twice, hat in hand, with his own figures on a scrap, and both times Cormac Jessup had been kindness itself, had sat him down and gone over the page with a pen explaining, and by the end of it Zachariah had come away, agreeing with him and not able to say quite how. He said, "A man like me argues with a man like that, All the town hears is a poor manager making excuses. He said, "My father broke this ground and I have run it 11 years, and I cannot make the figures agree with the cattle, and I have got to a place where I believe it is me." Myra said, "It is not you." She said it quiet. She did not say the rest of it, not yet. The rest of it was this. The Bar C note carried interest at 10%, which was hard but honest for that country in that year. The bank was compounding it monthly and entering it as annual. 2 hay payments Zachariah had made in person, in cash in September, were credited 11 weeks late, after the interest ran. And there was a line item repeated 3 times in 3 years. Improvement assessment, $60, $90, $120, for improvements on land the bank did not own and had never made. Set against the plain arithmetic, Zachariah Ingram should have been within $140 of clear. Instead, the book said he owed $906. She checked it 4 times over 4 nights before she let herself believe it, because a person does not accuse a bank in a town of 400 on a hunch. And then she sat on it, and I want you to understand why, because it is the thing that cost her the most. Every figure she had came out of the bank's own book. That book belonged to Cormac Jessup. He could correct it. He could lose it in a stove. He could stand in front of a judge and call it the honest error of a busy man. And she would be a farm wife with an X for a signature calling a bank president a thief. She needed a second set of numbers that Jessup did not own and could not reach, and she could not think where on God's earth such a thing might be kept. Then came the second Saturday in May and the mercantile, and the town made its position plain. Myra was at the counter with a list, buying wire staples and coal oil and a paper of needles, and Lavinia Jessup came in behind her with 2 other women, and there was a small piece of theatre about who had been at the counter first. Lavinia Jessup was not a cruel woman by her own lights. She was the president of the Ladies' Aid, and she had buried 2 children, and she had a firm sense of what a town owed itself, and what a town owed itself, in her view, was standards. She said, to the room rather than to Myra, that she wondered whether a woman who could not sign her own name had any business at all on a mortgaged place, and that there were families in the valley who had been ruined by exactly that kind of arrangement, and that she said it out of Christian concern. Cormac Jessup came in on the end of it, because he came in on the end of most things in that town. He was 50, silver at the temples, and he had the finest manners in Red Willow, and he laid his hand on the counter beside Myra's list and said, easily, warmly, without a scrap of heat in it, that he hoped Mrs. Ingram would not take offence, but that the bank did like to see a borrower's household in order, and that a man in Zachariah's position might have chosen a wife who could at least keep his accounts. Zachariah Ingram set down the keg he was carrying. He was not a talker, and everybody there knew it, and that is why the store went so still. He said, "Mr. Jessup, my wife has been on my place 3 weeks. In that time she has doctored 9 head. I would have lost and broke out 4 acres of new hay ground that I did not have hands for." He said, "Whatever a woman is supposed to be able to do with a pen, mine can do with her hands and her horse, and I would thank you and your missus to speak of her the way you would speak of me." Then he said, and this is the line the storekeeper repeated for years, "My wife is not an arrangement. She is my wife." They went out. Myra did not say a word the whole way to the wagon, and she did not say a word for the first 2 miles, and then, on the grade below the bench, she said, "That was a good thing you did in there," and Zachariah said it was not a thing, it was only true, and she looked at the road a while and said, "Most folks cannot tell the difference." That was the evening he moved his bedroll out of the lean-to, and neither of them ever discussed that either. If this story is warming something in you, stay with me now, because the next part is where it turns, and the turn came on a Monday in a dust-blown street over a piece of paper that should not have existed. Kirby Boyd farmed 160 acres of creek bottom 8 miles east, alone, with a 4-year-old girl named Ruthie and a milk cow and 11 acres in oats. Her husband Amos had proved up on that homestead and had died under a wagon 2 years before, and Kirby Boyd had never in her life borrowed $1, because Amos had been raised by a father who believed debt was a kind of drinking. On the 9th of June, a deputy served her a foreclosure notice on the courthouse walk in front of 11 people. The Stockman's Trust held a mortgage on her place for $600, dated the 9th of March, 1881, signed by Amos Boyd, witnessed and sealed by a notary public. She was in arrears. The sale had been advertised in the county paper since the middle of May. where a woman who does not take the paper would never see it, and it was set for the 12th of June on the courthouse steps, and the notice put into her hand that morning was only the last courtesy the law required. She said, over and over, "My husband never signed that." She said it the way people do when they know that saying it is useless, louder each time, and the crowd's sympathy went soft and embarrassed the way a crowd's does when it decides a woman is simply mistaken about her own affairs. Myra Hawthorne asked to see it. Kirby Boyd handed it over because she was drowning, and Myra's was the only hand out. And Myra read the notice through and then asked mildly whether a person might see the mortgage itself and not merely the notice of it. Cormac Jessup had come out onto the bank steps by then, and he sent his clerk in for the instrument and had it carried down and laid in her hands, because nothing on this earth quiets a crowd like the sight of a dead husband's own signature, and he wanted the widow quieted and the street satisfied. He would have 7 years in the territorial penitentiary to think about that. Myra stood there in the wind with the original in her 2 hands and did not read it the way a person reads a letter. She read it the way her father had taught her to read a bill of lading, which is to say she read it backward, from the figures up. 3 things. The interest column ran to 4 places on a $600 note. No country clerk carries 4 places on round money. That is a man who has back-figured a total and then built a column to reach it. The signature. Amos Boyd's signature on the mortgage sat perfectly level and perfectly even, every letter the same height, the way a signature looks when a hand has copied it slowly rather than written it fast. And the ink had not bitten the paper at the start of the downstrokes the way a moving pen bites. And the date, the 9th of March, 1881. Myra Hawthorne looked up and asked Kirby Boyd when Amos had gotten his patent on that homestead, and Kirby said, "The fall of '82, we hung it on the wall," and Myra Hawthorne said, out loud, in the street, then he could not have mortgaged it in '81 because in '81 it was not his to mortgage. It belonged to the United States government. Cormac Jessup was still smiling, and he said that the poor woman was distressed and that the bank had every sympathy, and that these matters were more complicated than they appeared to a person unfamiliar with them. And Myra Ingram said, in a voice that carried up and down the whole street, "Mr. Jessup, I would like to see the bank's books. I want you to understand how that landed." She was the woman who had signed an X. Half that street had watched her do it 7 weeks before. A man by the harness shop laughed first, and then the boardwalk went with him, and somebody called out to fetch her a picture book, and somebody else said the words that got repeated in the transcript. Ask her to see them. She cannot read them. And Lavinia Jessup, at the top of the bank steps beside her husband, did not laugh, but she smiled and turned her face away, which was its own kind of verdict. Cormac Jessup let it run, and when it had run he said kindly that the bank's books were the bank's, and that he would open them gladly to any officer of the court who cared to ask, and he went back inside, and the door shut, and that should have been the end of it. It was not because of an old man in the recorder's office who had been waiting 2 years for somebody to ask him a question. Jericho Penn was 71 and had been county recorder since the county had been a county. His eyes had gone to a milky ruin, and he did his filing by feel and by the honesty of the men who handed him paper, and for the last 4 years Cormac Jessup, who sat on the county board and had the run of every office in that building, had been in the habit of entering the bank's own instruments into the deed book himself, in his own hand, as a neighbourly favour to an old man who could no longer see the lines. Penn had known for a long while that something in his books was wrong. He had not been able to see it well enough to say so, and he had not been able to say it well enough to be believed. He caught Myra's sleeve in the doorway of his office, and he said, "Lo, Mrs. Ingram, the mortgages get filed here, and I cannot vouch for a page of it, but the patents are federal. The original entry papers and the final proofs are at the United States Land Office down in Cheyenne, where no man of this county can touch them, and the notary rolls are with the territorial secretary 2 streets over from it. Nobody here has ever gone and looked because nobody here has ever had cause." Then he said, "I have had men read me figures in this office for 11 years. You read them different. You read them like you're checking somebody." She said, "I am." That night at the Bar C they laid it out on the table. 64 miles to Cheyenne. The Boyd sale on the 12th. The Bar C's own redemption on the 12th the same morning, because Jessup had stacked them, the way he stacked all of them, so that no man's trouble left him time to notice anybody else's. It was the 9th. They had 3 days. Zachariah said he would go. Myra said, "You cannot. You do not know what to ask for." She said it plain, and it was not a kindness, and it was not meant to be. And then she took his account book and turned it around on the table under the lamp, and she read 4 lines of it aloud to him. She read the compounding. She read the 11 weeks. She read the improvement assessments. She read them fast, and she carried the difference in her head and gave him the number 906 against 140. And she said, "Zachariah, I have been able to do this since I was 11 years old, and I have not told a living soul in 6 years, because the last time I did, 3 men took my father's freight line off me with a paper I was not allowed to look at." He sat with that a long while. Then he laughed, once, not happy, and said, 7 weeks I have watched you sit with that book feeling sorry for you." She said, "I know it." He said, "Ride the bay. He is not the fastest, but he does not quit." She left at 2 in the morning with a lantern, a sack of biscuit, $41 borrowed off the hay money, and Jericho Penn's written list of exactly what to ask for, and she made Cheyenne a little after dark the following night, having walked the bay the last 9 miles because he had begun to stumble, and she would not ride a stumbling horse. The land office opened at 9. She was on the step at 7. It took her the whole of that day, and this is the part I found in the office's own visitor log, because the clerk noted it down. A woman requesting the track book's entries and final proofs. Red Willow Precinct, 1879 through 1883. He noted it because it was unusual, and because she was still at the table when he came to lock up, and he let her stay. She pulled 14 homesteads. She copied by hand for 11 hours, and at the noon recess she walked 2 streets over to the office of the territorial secretary and paid to have the notary commission roll searched and copied as well. Then she asked the clerk what it cost to have every sheet certified true under the office seal, because she had learned a long time ago that a paper a man can call a forgery is not a paper at all. It came to 15 cents the page. It took nearly the whole of the $41, and the clerk, who had watched her work since 7 that morning without a meal, stamped the last 11 sheets and did not charge her for them. And it was all there, in the plainest arithmetic a person ever laid eyes on. Amos Boyd's final proof was dated October of 1882. The patent had issued that same fall. The mortgage the Stockman's Trust held against his land was dated March of 1881, 19 months before the man owned a square foot of it. That was not an error. That was a document invented after the fact by somebody who knew the widow could not check and had guessed at a date. 4 other mortgages in Jessup's favour carried the same defect, dated ahead of the patent they were drawn against, and the notary roll finished it. Every one of those 5 instruments bore the seal and hand of one Ellery Vaughan, notary public. The territorial secretary's roll showed Ellery Vaughan's commission had lapsed in June of 1880 and had never been renewed, and a marginal note in another clerk's hand recorded that Vaughan had died at Rawlins in the winter of 1881. 2 of the mortgages he had supposedly witnessed were dated 1882. A dead man had notarized them, and in the tract book for Section 19, Township 22, she found the name Trask, and she stopped and copied that one twice. The bay was finished. He had walked the last 9 miles into Cheyenne, and he was not going to make 64 more, and at 8 o'clock that night, Myra Ingram stood in the street with the whole thing sealed and folded inside her coat and no way on God's earth to get it home. It was the clerk who settled that. His brother kept a livery on the same street, and between them they traded her a young sorrel against the bay until she could come back for him, and would not take the difference in money once they understood what the copying had been for. She rode out of Cheyenne at 9 that night, and she rode through the whole of the night of the 11th, and she came into Red Willow on the morning of the 12th with the sorrel lathered, and her copies in an oilcloth inside her coat, and the courthouse steps were already full, because a foreclosure sale in a small town draws the same crowd a hanging draws. Cormac Jessup had the bank's own ledger carried up and laid open on a lectern at the top of the steps, because the law would not let a man sell another man's land out from under him until he had declared the sum due out of his own books, in the open, where anybody could hear it. In 11 years, nobody in that county had ever asked Cormac Jessup a single question about a figure he read off that stand. He had no reason on earth to think today would be different. Kirby Boyd worked her way up through the crowd with her daughter on her hip, and Zachariah came in at the corner with Jericho Penn, and Penn had spent the 2 days Myra was gone knocking on doors, so that 9 families whose paper she had asked about before she rode came in behind him. She came up the steps and asked Judge Thaddeus Croft, who was there to confirm the sales, for leave to speak, and Croft, who had come up from Laramie and did not know her from Adam, gave it to her because he was a careful man, and because Jericho Penn was standing there nodding like a bell clapper. Then Myra Hawthorne Ingram read out loud, on the courthouse steps of Red Willow, in front of the entire town that had laughed at her 8 weeks before. She read the mortgage date on the Boyd note, and then the patent date out of the federal tract book, and let the 19 months sit in the air. She read 4 more the same way. She read Ellery Vaughan's name off 5 seals, and then she read the commission roll, lapsed the 14th of June, 1880, and then she read the marginal entry, died at Rawlins, February 1881, and she asked the judge to explain to her how a dead man with an expired commission had witnessed a signature in November of 1882. Cormac Jessup said her papers were forgeries and demanded to know how an unlettered woman had come by them. And Myra said, "They are certified copies under the seal of the United States Land Office and the seal of the Territorial Secretary of Wyoming, and I came by them the way anybody in this valley could have, by riding 64 miles and asking." Then she said, "Mr. Jessup, I asked you 3 days ago to show me your books. Your book is open on that stand. Let us read them together." She read his own ledger against her copies for 11 minutes. She read the compounding on the Bar C. She read the 11-week credit lag on cash payments taken in front of witnesses. She read the improvement assessments and asked each time for the improvement. She read the ledger's own running total and then gave the true one from memory before she had finished the column, and Judge Croft made her do that twice, and the second time he had the clerk check it on paper, and the clerk stood up and said, "Your Honour, she is right to the penny." That was the sound of a town changing its mind. It is a very quiet sound. There was one thing she read that nobody had come to hear. Section 19, Township 22. Dorsey Trask, who everybody in Red Willow knew had gone under 2 winters back and had sold out cheap to the bank and pulled south with a wagon and a mule and had died of a lung sickness at a road ranch on the Chugwater before the spring. He had not sold out. The federal tract book showed his patent issued clean in the spring of 1881, and the mortgage that took his ground was dated 10 months after that, sealed by a man who had been 11 months in his grave, and entered into Jericho Penn's deed book in Cormac Jessup's own handwriting, 9 days before the bank foreclosed on him. His daughter Landry Trask was in that crowd. She was 19 and she worked at the hotel, and she had not spoken to anybody about her father in 2 years, because she had believed what the town believed, which was that he had failed. Myra Ingram came down off those steps in front of everybody and told her, "He did not fail, and I have got it here in the government's own hand." And Landry Trask put her face in her hands, and there was not a thing anybody could do about it, because Dorsey Trask was still dead, and no ledger in the world was going to bring him back up the Chugwater Road. Some of it you get back, some of it is just gone, and it stays gone, and the honest part of a story is that it says so. The judge voided the sales that morning from the bench, then and there. He struck the Bar C's redemption with them, since it was set to fall that same noon on the same doctored figures. He impounded the bank's books entire, and Deputy United States Marshal Wade Sutter took Cormac Jessup into custody on the courthouse steps at 11 o'clock. And because the man had to go down to the federal jail at Cheyenne, and because he would not walk to the wagon, they put him in irons and marched him the length of the middle of that street in front of 400 people. 3 days, near enough to the hour, from the moment the woman who had signed an X asked to see the books. He was tried that November. The forged instruments came to 11, and the true figure the bank had taken out of that valley beyond what it was owed came to $9,640. He drew 7 years at the Territorial Penitentiary. Not one soul from Red Willow appeared for his character. The Bar C came out of it clear, with $140 honest balance against it, and a note the court rewrote at the true rate, and Zachariah Ingram paid the whole of it out of that fool's beef with money left over, which he could have done any year of the last 4 if the arithmetic had ever once been his own. Kirby Boyd kept her creek bottom, and Ruthie Boyd grew up on it. The 9 families who had stood at the corner of that courthouse got their ground back, everyone, and 4 of them collected money besides out of what the receiver wrung out of the bank. Section 19 went back into Trask hands before the snow, because a sale founded on a forgery is not a sale at all in any court in this country, no matter how many winters have gone over it. Landry Trask quit the hotel and ran sheep on her father's ground, which Dorsey Trask would have hated, and made money at it, which he would not have. They rode home the long way that evening, the 2 of them, side by side and not hurrying, with the light going purple over the bench and the borrowed sorrel walking careful because he had earned it. Zachariah said he had a thing to say, and would say it badly. He said that when Caroline died, he had quit expecting anybody to stand up in a room on his behalf ever again, and that he had built his whole life around not needing it, and that he had been fairly comfortable in that arrangement until a woman came down out of a coach and asked him about his water. He said, I did not know how much I had stopped believing in until you rode into that town this morning." And Myra told him her half of it. She said she had not chosen him out of pity, and she wanted that on the record between them. She said she had stood in that line in 4 towns and listened to men talk about what they owned, and he was the only one who had talked about what he took care of. She said, "I picked an honest man and good ground with good water, and I have been right about ground my whole life, and I was not going to start doubting myself over a mortgage." Then she said, "And I am going to keep books again, Zachariah," out loud, in front of people, and I am done hiding it. He said that suited him fine. Lavinia Jessup came out to the Bar C in July, alone, driving herself, which nobody had ever seen her do. Her husband's crimes had cost her the house, the pew, and every friend she had, and she had learned in 6 weeks a thing about a town that Myra had known since St. Joseph, which is that respectability is a loan and it gets called. She stood in the yard and would not come in, and she said what she had come to say, which was that she had stood on those bank steps and smiled while the whole street laughed at an honest woman, and that she had not known what her husband was, but she had never once troubled to ask, and that not asking had been a comfortable arrangement for 20 years. She said, "I have no right to your forgiveness, and I have not come for it." She had come with the ledgers. The reorganized bank had asked her, as restitution, and because there was no one else the court would trust to carry them, to bring the stockmen's trust books out to the Bar C and put them in Myra Ingram's hands, along with the offer of the position of keeper of accounts at $80 the quarter. Myra took them. She took them on 3 conditions, and she made Judge Croft write all 3 into the bank's own charter that fall, and they are there in the county's papers to this day, in a clerk's copperplate, under the heading Conditions of Acceptance, Monsieur Ingram. First, that every borrower in the valley had the right, once each quarter, to have their own account read aloud to them, entry by entry, in the borrower's presence, by a person of the borrower's choosing, and not the bank's. Second, that no lien and no instrument affecting any patent in that county could be filed without the recorder's own witness upon it, and the recorder's witness could not be a bank officer or a bank officer's kin. And third, that no soul in Red Willow was ever again to be measured by the mark they made on a page. Jericho Penn, who could not read the charter he had helped write, had it read to him twice, and cried both times, and said it was the only useful thing he had done in 40 years, which was not true, but he believed it. Myra Ingram kept the honest books of that valley for 31 years. She rode her own range at the Bar C in the mornings, and did the accounts in the afternoons, and she and Zachariah raised 4 children on that bench, and she never once got over the habit of reading a column backward from the figures up. But the thing she is actually remembered for out there is the school. She started it in the winter of 1885 in the back room of the recorder's office, 2 nights a week for grown men and women, and she did not teach them letters first. She taught them numbers, interest and principal, and what compounding does, and how to spot a total that has been built backward to meet a sum somebody had already decided on. Kirby Boyd was in the first class. Landry Trask was in the first class. Grown ranchers sat on nail kegs with pencils in their fists and learned to check a page, and Myra Ingram told them every single term the same thing to start with, that she had signed her own marriage register with an X in front of that whole town and had let them believe it for 8 weeks, and that a mark on a page tells you exactly nothing about what a person can do. There was never another forged deed filed in that county. Not one. Not because the people out there were better than anybody else, but because after 1884, everybody could check. So that is the story of the illiterate bride of Red Willow, who was not illiterate at all, and who took 3 days and a borrowed horse to walk a banker out of town in irons. I think about her conditions more than I think about the arrest. Anybody can want a bad man punished. It takes something rarer to stand in the exact spot where you were humiliated, with the whole town finally willing to hand you anything you ask for, and ask instead that nobody else ever be measured the way you were. If somebody has ever looked at you and decided, from the outside, what you were capable of, I hope this one sat right with you. Tell me down in the comments about the person in your life whose worth the world got wrong. I read every one of them, and I mean that. Come on back and sit with me again soon. There is always more of this country's paper to go through, and I will leave the gate open for you.